The rough outline for this workshop is as follows. It's sort of an open-ended deep dive. There isn't really a very good red line or narrative structure. It's more me messing around with data, numbers, and seeing what we can extract from motions. But roughly what we will cover then is 4 things. We'll talk about the types of motions, so this house would, so forth. We'll talk about the themes, so for instance, politics, economics, other common themes that show up in motions. We'll talk about the difficulty of motion, or how do you judge generally, like what's an easier motion, what's a tougher one. And then lastly, we'll talk about a balance or imbalance, something that you may be concerned, especially if you're an adjudicator or chief adjudication panel. And I'll mention that all of these are motivated by me being the national coach, so I'm also curious, of course, as a personal incentive, like what kind of motions should I set for the team? With that, let's start with the first question that we have, and that is, what is the most common motion type? This is probably an easier question to answer, but for instance, again, you know that there's this House would. Recently in British parliamentary, they introduced this House predicts that something will happen, and you might debate that. There's all kinds of other opposes, regrets, yada, yada. So how would we go about answering this relatively simple question? Like, what is the most common motion type? Well, luckily for us, there is something called Tabicat, which I'm sure many of you have already faced if you've ever competed in a national tournament, organized the tournament, and so forth. But it is, in essence, a software, online software, where you can input and track debate tournaments. This is an example from a Stockholm pre-UDC, and there is a few motions that you can see here in somewhat small text, but for instance, this house would register as a mail order bride, and so forth. The nice part about this software is that it is free and it is open source. What this means, and many people don't probably realize this, but volunteers around the world literally put in hundreds of hours into upkeeping these systems, and we have open access to them for free if you ever run debate tournaments and so forth. This is just a small detour to point out that this is a very nice thing that happens in the world, and there is some names of people who have made this possible and who recently upkeep it, like Atyan. He's the tab of many WSDC tournaments and so forth. Okay, let's go back to the question then. Here's our action plan. There's a bunch of public Tabicat links around the world, right? Like the Stockholm pre-UDC and so forth. So what if we collect a bunch of these links? Then we scrape motions from each tournament. So we take a bunch of motions, as you saw in the picture. And then lastly, we just simply take out or parse out the types from these motions, right? So here's how we can get started. And in my sort of mini investigation, I've gathered about 50, in this case, British parliamentary primary tournaments. You can see some examples over here in small text, like some Australian, Edu Drift, and so forth. And overall, about 1,078 motions. I know the title said 2,000. There's also WSDC motions, but those we'll touch upon later. A preview then of what this data looks like. Roughly, after gathering all the data from a website, we end up with a table. I'm sorry that this is really hard to see, but the general idea here is that you have a column and a row for each motion that we've picked out from a tournament. And you'll see the motion on the left, potentially an info slide, the tournament that it comes from, the year that it comes from, if that's available, the rounds, so for instance, grand finals, round 7, and so forth, as well as the motion type. And you can see there's a prefers, believes, and yada, yada. So with that said, I'll ask you to go back to Mentimeter, which is your poll device, and I'll ask you for the first question for your intuition on what you think are the most common motion types. So try to predict what 1,000 motions resolve to. Here are the options. Okay, I think we can start discussing. So we have this house believes that first, this house would next, supports, regrets, prefers after. I think that's generally good intuition. It makes sense. Let's look at the actual data and see what happened there. If I go back here, and here's the rough graph of all the motion types gathered from roughly 2014 up to 2025. You'll see that, in fact, as predicted, believes and would are the top 2 motions. Perhaps slightly unexpectedly to me. And you'll notice some other motion types. Can look at statistic here. The believes motion is actually far, far outweighing all the other motion types. So rough statistics, if you go to a motion tournament, a tournament, and you pick a random motion from there, roughly you'll have a 57% chance of landing on a belief motion. I think that's a pretty interesting statistic, and then you'll see kind of an exponential drop-off afterwards. Okay, this is cool, but realistically, there isn't that much usefulness that we gain from this. It's just a nice statistic to know. With that said, are there any comments so far before we proceed to other discussion as well on this? Any free questions? Maybe something you expected, something you didn't expect? Okay, I think not. In that case, we can go on to the second and perhaps slightly more useful metric. This was kind of a warm-up, right? Let's then talk about what are the most common motion themes. So naturally, again, motivated by me being the national coach, I want to coach the team to do something useful in debates. I want them to know a diversity of different areas and topics and so forth, right? There's politics, economics, Chinese relations, there is all kinds of motions, feminism, blah, blah, blah. How do I actually pick out the ones to teach them and to focus on? So this is where we dive into slightly deeper weeds of mathematics, and I'll try to be very brief here so that I don't lose any of you. But let me know if there's any questions or if you want to talk about this further as well. I know there's people who are more interested also in the deeper weeds after. But we have to talk about natural language processing, or NLP as you'll see it shortened. And natural language processing, in a very, very simple sense, is just taking a word and converting it into numbers. And that's what underpins the backbone of ChatGPT and many other technologies that you currently use. Let's look through a simple example so you get a rough intuition of how this will work and how we will apply this to debate motions, and we'll go on to the actual data. Simple example then is that if we have these two motions, right, this house believes that sports should not be televised, we can convert it into two numbers. In this case, very simple again. We'll have two random numbers, not quite random, but essentially random, 0.1, 0.9, right? Then we'll have another motion and we can convert it into 0.8, 0.2. So we can treat these as XY coordinates and then plot them on a 2D graph. So you'll notice that I've just taken the points, I've taken the motions, I've plotted them on a graph. So on the x-axis we have 0.8, 0.2. You should all be familiar with this relatively simple Cartesian plot. The next thing that we can do is take some more motions and plot them on the same graph, right? So let's take another one. Let's have this house would ban sports, and then this house would make wet pet food mandatory for whatever reason. You might start noticing a pattern here already in that some motions tend to bunch up to certain places, right? And on a certain axis. So maybe what we can infer then is that perhaps the x-axis, so the more a motion is on the right side, the more petty or the more pets, more animals it actually has, right? And the more the motion is on the y-axis, the more sports it has in it. We can take this a step further and actually classify these motions into groups. So now we are like, okay, let's draw somewhere an imaginary line in the middle, and let's say that all motions that fall on this side of the line are the pet motions, and then all the motions on that side of the line are the sport motions. So congratulations. Now, after listening to the workshop, you have a certification as an AI engineer. You can post it on LinkedIn. But realistically, this is essentially what happens on a greater level in ChatGPT and so forth. The only difference is that instead of using two numbers, in this case to represent sports and pets, right, we know that we can't condense all motions into just sports and pets. We'll have motions about politics, motions about econ, motions about China, and so forth. So what we'll do is, instead of using two numbers, we'll actually use about 768, or maybe 2048. These are somewhat arbitrary, but we call them dimensions in machine learning. Unfortunately, our brains are not so advanced to visualize 768 dimensions, so different directions of motions, right? However, what we can do is then reduce this information back into three numbers, or dimensions. So a lot of things happening here, right? But I hope this plot somewhat clarifies it. After all this machinations with motions, we're left with three numbers for each motion, and this is roughly how it looks like when we plot them. So you don't need to remember anything that I've told you before up to this point, but looking at this graph, the main pieces of intuition that you need to have is that every dot represents a unique motion here. The closer a dot is to another dot, the more similar these two motions are, and that roughly colors represent a certain theme. For instance, we can have in green political motions and so forth. I'll talk about this in a second. And roughly there are 14 themes. Why 14? Ask me later, but somewhat arbitrary numbers. Before I then reveal how these themes actually look like and we dive into a little bit more exploration on this, I want to test your intuition again. So let's go back to Mentimeter, and I'll give you a question as to what kind of motions, what kind of themes would you expect there to see across motions. So roughly 14 different themes. Might be politics, might be economics. Place your guesses. Of the collateral issues. Someone misspelled cultural. But yes, this makes sense to me intuitively. We have politics in the center, so a lot of people are going for that. Economics also makes sense, especially considering we're dealing with primarily British parliamentary motions. So those are from university debates. You'll probably see slightly harder, tougher topics to discuss there. Social justice, education, climate change, interesting. AI, I think, as well is interesting, and then international relations.
I also think that we are quite biased because you just mentioned politics.
That is true.
So a lot of people thought of politics in
Yeah. Yeah, and politics is also probably a very broad category that we can split into several different dimensions. Okay, let's go back to the data then and see what the AI overlords have deemed the motions to be. So roughly looking then, here are the categories of motions that we're able to extract from 1,000 different motions. These are arranged from top to bottom in the order of how many motions there are per category. So the top are the ones that are most prominent, and then you can see it also in the bubble graph, bubble chart, whatever. So the size of the bubble represents the quantity of motions that fall into it. How these are labeled is also an interesting discussion, and then we can talk about this afterwards generally, but one thing that you need to kind of understand is that from the machine learning perspective, when we do this division into groups, we don't necessarily get a label afterwards, so we need to also come up with this label. But we can do so by looking at several motions and guessing. But interesting insight here is that we have economic intervention somewhere around the top, and we can look at some examples of what falls under economic intervention to make it more tangible. But I think roughly what we probably expected, econ is at the top. Maybe politics is a little bit below than initially thought. I think it falls somewhere into policy and governance, social justice. It's more split into different groups. And we have philosophical concepts. And then going down, we have motions about minority groups, Sino affairs, which I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly. I searched it up. This was actually affairs related to China and all the relationships between the US and China there. Societal norms, religious ideology, sports and culture. So you've probably faced many of these motions as well. Let's look a little bit deeper into how these actually represent, and I will show you a way you can actually interact with these motions. So here's, for example, this same motion cloud graph that we saw. And you'll see that if I toggle this off in a sec, sorry, I have to look back all the time because it's not on my screen.
A quick question on the machine learning aspect. So what you use for this is a clustering algorithm, essentially?
Yeah, it was a k-means clustering if we're talking about that. But yes. Yeah, so roughly here's the cloud that you saw already before in a static form. It's a little bit tough to see again from the screen, I'm sorry about that. But you can see that I can play around with it, I can kind of move it, and you'll see that different colors represent roughly the same categories. Again, the closer the motions are to each other, the more similar they are. So one thing we can do is we can, for instance, double click this, and we'll have feminist and LGBTQ plus strategy motions. And you'll see that, for instance, we can pick out some over here. Sorry about the quality. Yeah, so this is related to somewhere in South Korea, dating, marriage with men, and so forth. Okay, so very, very tough motion here. But you'll see that we're able to pick out a few others as well to relate to that. So maybe let's read out one. This house believes that as the feminist movement, we would encourage women to reject acts of chivalry, for instance, men buying drinks, holding doors open, ladies first, yada yada. And we can see that next to it, for instance, is another motion over here, so roughly probably similar. This house believes that the Indian feminist movement should actively encourage women to participate in the Agnivir scheme. There's an info slide for that. So the scheme is launched by the Indian government, is a short-term military recruitment program for youth aged 17.5 to 21 years old. Okay, so the classification sort of put these two together roughly or somewhat similarly. Yeah. But as we can see, these are roughly all the feminist LGBTQ plus motions, and you can kind of interact with them in a way that you see which motions are related to each other. You can toggle different groups, see others. Okay, why is this actually useful? And how would we use this? So this was kind of a sneak peek of the web app. We'll discuss this in a second as well. But how might you use this? Well, as a debater, I probably want to find similar motions to those in my blind spot. So if I notice that I do poorly at tournaments, in particular regarding feminist motions, or maybe heavy economics motions or law motions, right? This is something that I can use to find similar motions, try to drill in practicing those. As a coach, I can ensure that my students cover motion themes holistically. So I probably would want to pick out one of these in each category, maybe proportionally to how often they show up at certain tournaments. As a CA, or chief adjudicator, I can attempt to diversify my tournament's motions. So ideally what I would want, right, is if we have this huge point cloud somewhere and there's all these motions, right, I would want to pick out motions that cover the area or the volume as much as possible so that they're very diverse and not focused on a specific group, right? So we want to discuss these. All right. Let's address some limitations then, as well with this study as with all. For instance, some of you may have already thought of this, but if we have a motion like this house as a dog owner would sign up their dog to compete in an athletics competition, is this really a pets motion or is this a sports motion? So if you remember the 2D graph that we showed, right, the dot is somewhere in the middle. It's very hard to put it into one specific cluster or one specific group. Ideally, we would probably use two different labels for this and label this as a pet motion and as a sports motion. From a technical perspective, this is a little bit tougher to do, which is why I haven't done it yet. Okay, a lot of math going on, or different discussion. Do we have any comments so far and thoughts on this?
So, how does like grouping actually work? When you showed it's not, you said like with the 2D example that you just draw an imaginary line.
Yeah.
But when we're going to like 11 dimensions, at least when you present it in 3 dimensions, you've got like all the orange dots here, but there's one singular orange dot on the other side.
Yes.
Like, how does that, what's the one orange dot on the other side?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we go back to the visual over here, right, you'll see that ideally what we would want, and this again touches into more heavy mathematical-ish concepts, but we would want a very tight cluster that is separated by color, right? We don't have this. So you'll notice that there are some outliers, so to speak, like motions over here, that are probably a little bit unrelated to the other groups, or at least deemed unrelated. The reason for this being, again, is that you cannot classify directly a motion into a specific cluster. Like we don't have isolated sports motions. They usually touch upon other issues like cultural and politics and yada yada. So how this actually works in practice is that the algorithm clusters in 768 dimensions, not in 3 dimensions. What you see here is a representation for us as humans to visualize, but is not the true representation of the underlying data, right? So obviously I can't visualize 768 dimensions, which is why we have 3D over here. But in reality, these are somewhere points in this 768 dimensional space. The clustering also works slightly different in that we don't draw a plane or a line or any kind of thing like that. What we do is k-means clustering, which means that we essentially look at point clouds or the closest points, the sort of kind of like a gravity-based system where you have different points that pull each other together, and then based on this pull, you kind of calculate which point should fall into which cluster. So yes, something that we can talk also about later, but good question. Any others so far? Okay, if not, then this was a lot of yap. So let's go to a chance for you to yap a little bit. So this is a small discussion break. I think the way we do this, here are some ground rules. So look around. You should probably, you've been here for 3-4 days now, but you probably still can try to find at least one person you haven't interacted with much. Approach them, group up with them, and you'll have about 10 minutes for discussion. I'll provide some thoughts and sparks for discussion as well.
We didn't discuss our favorite emotions, but we discussed it in like from debaters, like high school or primary school debaters' perspective, that they usually like debating political or economical topics more than the ones about like abstract things like philosophical concepts or values and so on.
For primary schoolers.
Yes, because in Croatia they debate Karl Popper, which are mostly about should be about value motions, but you know, it is, I think, more intuitive for a debater to understand why something economic or political would be important, or what are the impacts, as opposed to, you know, debating about romantic relationships.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. So more interested in politics and econ primary schoolers. We'll have to take some of that to Finland somehow. Any other thoughts from what you discussed? I heard there was an interesting discussion in the group on the left about how aligning with something and beliefs in something and then debating against or for that. So if someone wants to share.
Yeah, no, because I mean, when you debate with, when you debate for something that you agree with, sometimes you take things for granted and, have a narrow-minded vision of that case. Whereas when you debate for something you disagree with, you kind of have to think outside the box and try to come up with brilliant ideas to defend it. And so sometimes it helps your case.
Yeah, we can have a quick show of hands. I don't have this in the Mentimeter. Do you think it's easier for you to debate something that you agree with versus something that you don't agree with? So those who think it's easier to debate something that you agree with, raise your hands. Wow, that's surprisingly low. One person in the whole room. Okay. Something that you disagree with. Okay, interesting. So a little, yeah, interesting.
But the rationale for that is, I think, really, it makes sense. Because for me, when I don't agree with something, it means that there hasn't been enough reasons, or like enough good reasons for me to actually believe that.
Mm.
So if I'm put in a position that makes me think of reasons that are actually, convincing, I have to start to find only the good ones. So instead of grouping them with every possible reason that would be convincing to a person who is not convinced by it, I believe in something. I believe in, I don't know, like the non-linear taxation, right? There's like a plethora of reasons, and I believe all of them are equally good. It's harder to find the best ones. And on the other side, I don't get the benefit of actually being convinced to the idea itself. So I have to convince myself.
Yeah, I can see that. I also heard from someone discussing that it's more fun to also play devil's advocate, where you have to debate against something that you don't like. So that might also play a role in that. And maybe you also are just mentally less narrow-minded, as discussed, if you disagree with something. So you actually do more research to convince yourself, convince the others.
But also, I feel like in most cases, even when people do believe in something, they don't have many strong reasons or arguments for believing in that. So the prep work that goes into both cases, like whether you believe in the motion or not, is kind of the same. Because debate is more about argumentation and research rather than your personal beliefs.
Yeah, that is true as well. Speaking of, there's an interesting question. How many of you have ever, if you remember, changed your mind because of debates or because you've debated a certain motion? So some societal issue maybe. Okay, so quite a few, I think, roughly at least. It's an interesting topic as well. Could be a benefit of debates to write for your IDEA applications or EU applications. But right, let's discuss difficulty, and let's try to discuss difficulty from a slightly more numbers perspective, which is already, as I'm going to flag, not a very good idea. Why is it not a good idea? Because difficulty, as you've probably found out in the group discussions, is inherently subjective. For instance, oh, yes. Sorry. No one told me. Yeah. And this was the previous slide, and then difficulty inherently subjective. So for instance, this motion, this house prefers a diverse number of highly competitive banks to a small number of banks, probably more centralized monopoly. Probably easy for some of you if you're an econ student. Not a very easy one for me, unfortunately. But I think that roughly gives an example of how it can be subjective. At the same time, we can all probably agree that the motion, this house prefers seeking a long-term relationship. Sorry, this house is a person seeking a long-term relationship. Thank you. Better be unfrozen now. Yes. This house, as a person seeking a long-term relationship, would refuse to use dating apps versus this house regrets the International Monetary Fund structural adjustment programs in African nations. Right? We can probably all agree, unless you have a really convincing reason, that the first one is the easier motion. Unless you are a very big nerd into international funding.
But like, the structural adjustment programs are long-term relationships, and IMF is basically a dating app, so I think this is very
Okay.
very toxic relationship.
Well, that's a good way to break it down, I suppose so.
We were actually discussing with our group like two different motions, like brain drain versus this house believes that and actually this is a real motion that the Danish society had in one of their competitions. This house believes that brats are better than, I don't know what's the opposite of brats. I'm not that jealousy. And we were saying that exactly this, that you know, like sometimes if I had that motion that they had at the Danish organization, I would not be able to say anything because I know nothing about it. And there are many people who don't know anything about dating apps.
Yeah, that is true. And
so it's always like perspective point. For example, I was just telling my friend some days ago that my friend actually got married from Hinge. So she found her husband on Hinge. So for me, knowing this story personally, I cannot, in my mind, the first motion doesn't say a lot. Because, yeah, you can find long-term relationship on dating apps, even a life partner.
yes, I think this is a very good reasoning as well. And part of the reason why I had such difficulty of coming up with some kind of difficulty metric, tautology. Maybe I forgot to motivate also why we're discussing this, but realistically, again, going back to me coaching the national team, I would probably want some kind of idea of roughly which motions are tougher, which ones are easier, so that I can adapt based on their level, based on what we're going for, and so forth. This is a motivation roughly for why you would want to measure something like this. But as identified, I think realistically, there is no objective metric that we can ever come up with to measure difficulty. However, there's probably something that comes out good of this discussion, which is why I think it's also important to mention. One thing that I was thinking of, okay, we can't really measure difficulty. It's subjective per person. Yes.
I was also thinking, like, in some tournament we have some sort of topic, and then you have, like, obviously each team, like, there are 4 places that have to be divided between each team, but probably in more difficult, or like now I understand that probably not working this way, but like maybe in more difficult topics, the average like speaker thing is lower because like both worse speakers struggle to make good quality speeches, and even better speakers have either the same level of their speech as usual or lower because they cannot be as convincing as with easier.
Yes, I think this is a really good idea and something that I've been thinking of as well. So the rough idea is that we take a tournament and we take a round that everyone debated in, and we average all the speaker points of every speaker for that round and motion specifically. And roughly, if it's like a standard or normal motion, it should come out to 75 because everybody gets a 75 and we have large enough population, and that's the average agreed upon, right? And then maybe we can infer that in motions that the average is 76, 77, it's an easier motion, everybody did better. Motions that are tougher, everybody gets like a 73 on average. So the good speakers still do 75, 76, 77, but the worse speakers struggle with motions. This is an interesting idea that we can talk about later. Not part of this presentation, but very good point. All right. One thing that then I was thinking of, maybe we can't measure difficulty, but we can to some extent measure the background knowledge or the background context you require. For instance, in the previous example, this house, as a person seeking a long-term relationships, would refuse to use dating apps. I think as pointed out, not everybody probably knows about dating apps and so forth, but I would imagine that if you approach a random person on the street and you ask them to debate this motion or just generally their opinions on this, they can give some kind of justification. So this is like an average intelligent voter perfect motion. We assign this a score of 1. A motion that this house regrets IMF structural adjustment programs. Unless you approach someone who is very economically inclined on the street, I doubt that they will give much justifications or really probably think that you're a weirdo. So maybe we assign this one a 5. Again, very arbitrary metric, not a very good quantifiable metric to point out, but just gives us a rough idea, right? So what is then my action plan? Very simple. I take each motion and I ask ChatGPT, how much background knowledge does this motion require, right? Because obviously I don't want to spend my Saturday going through 1,000 motions and individually thinking about how much background knowledge or how much of an average intelligent voter you have to be to understand this motion. And then we do this for 1,000 motions. I'm not sure why I put baby there. I think I was writing this late in the evening. Okay, but looking roughly at then the distribution. So this is again sourced from the British Parliamentary Tournament, university debate, probably slightly tougher than average motions. Also from top tournaments or large tournaments, so probably dealing with, again, slightly tougher motions, just intuitively. Here's roughly what our distribution looks like. So you'll notice that there is very little average intelligent voter motions, or just very basic ones, and then quite a lot of the in the 4 range. Again, very vague, abstract metric that you maybe shouldn't trust so much, as pointed out. I think the speaker scores is a much better idea, but just as a rough intuition. What can we infer from here then? Well, the motions skew towards an assumption of background knowledge. So probably if you're going into a university debate, especially in the top tournaments, you will have to have some kind of understanding of how IR works in general, or how the EU Parliament works, maybe something of the sort, which is, I think, roughly intuitive, right? And the nice part is now, well, we can filter by the difficulty level. So if we have a motion, we can roughly, I am able to go to my national team and I'm going to, like, today we're doing a hard econ motion and they will hate me, and then I'm going to filter to like 4 and 5 in the difficulty level. So very rough, arbitrary metric. That said, I was really hoping for more from this. And some of the things that, for instance, I tried to do is, okay, well, how about we look at difficulty compared by theme? So can we tell any kind of meaningful like increase in difficulty for a certain topic that we debate? And I guess this makes sense roughly. Societal norms, things are probably a little bit, again, like dating or so forth, probably a little more accessible to the average voter. We have sports somewhere there in culture. I guess somewhat accessible. I'm not sure about this because sports motion can be tricky as well, especially for myself. And then as we go towards IR global developments, then we do have an increase in difficulty. But again, if you look at this, it's not really meaningful. So I think that was the average that I took. And
what's the calculation here?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because that's I'm inserted.
Yeah. So I believe I took the average. I probably might need to take the median as well. There's a discussion about statistics that you could have there. But I think this is just the average of taking every motion in that specific theme, average the difficulty of all the motions, and this is the Y value that you get. So my fault for not labeling it very well. Rookie 101 mistake. But yeah, you'll see that there is a roughly, again, some kind of correlation or generally an increase towards economics and IR motions, but nothing that you can meaningfully really reason about. I guess this, like, intuitively we all knew that probably econ motions, yeah, will require a bit more knowledge about econ. Yeah. So that's one of the things that we can do. The other thing that we can do is, okay, well, maybe we do difficulty by type. So we discussed already the types of motions. So this house would, this house supports. Again, nothing super meaningful here as well. I guess opposes, regrets, hopes, welcomes are slightly, these are, by the way, very much outliers. There isn't many motions that use welcomes and so forth, but slightly lower in difficulty. I guess that makes sense. It's more opinion-based. So again, I say difficulty. Remember that this is a proxy for background knowledge, so not necessarily difficulty. And then predicts, I suppose, requires the most background knowledge because you have to predict that something will happen. I think predicts debates are generally like less value-based. So this house predicts that humanity will end in 100 years or so forth, or this house predicts that Donald Trump will get elected, right? You'll need some kind of background knowledge. Yes, of course.
I'm not sure if I missed or you didn't explain. How did you how did you come up with this result?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of motions, and each of them has a label assigned to it, which is a type of the motion. So for instance, a would, a supports, or so forth. And then we have, like, say, 100 of would motions, or however many there were, a bit more than that. And then we just average all the difficulties that we got for those motions, and then we get a single metric. I'm showing these, but I'm showing these more as an example of what you shouldn't do or what you shouldn't trust, rather than something that I'm particularly, like, proud about. So I think this is kind of more of a case of, yeah, this is interesting to look at, but realistically I was hoping for a little bit more from this. I think one way to do that is what was suggested in terms of speaker scores. That might be a slightly more objective metric. There's a good point to discuss limitations for this, and of course, ChatGPT. Yes, in 1 second. ChatGPT, probably not the most trustworthy evaluator, and also not the most useful metric as of now, as we discussed. Yes, nitpicks.
Shouldn't when you maybe show like the table, shouldn't it start from 1 1 means no background knowledge necessary, and there's no point in showing 0 and 0 and 0.5 because there's no 0.5 option.
Oh, you mean over here on the graph? Or?
Yeah, the graph should start from 1 row.
Yeah, I suppose so. I didn't really tinker with the labels much. This is kind of the default. But yes, you cannot really have. Well, actually, you could have an. No, yeah, you can't have an 0.5. Yeah, you're right, because it starts from. Yeah. No, but good point. Yeah, I should probably start from 1 as well to show the scale. But relatively, it doesn't change much in terms of the bars. So. But good note. Thank you. Those are always appreciated. Let's have some more comments if you have anything to touch upon difficulty, besides what was mentioned as well. Generally, what your thoughts are on this. If you have any other ideas for measuring as well, or sort of personal opinions on this. Yes, from there.
Oh, this is like very easy. How easy is it to like continue filling it with more motions, like improving it, or maybe coming up with your own motions and then choosing them?
Yes, so we'll discuss this towards the end as well. But roughly to answer, each motion, adding a certain motion, is now isolated in an extent that you can add another motion without messing that much with all the data to some extent. Basically, the goal long term is also to have a website where you can add your own motions, and then we can have collectively grow the motion collections. Or at least if you heard of data.debates.fi, also a service that collects a bunch of tournaments motions. So anything of that sort I think would be really cool to have some kind of map for motions in the world. Yes?
I want to ask you, were you wondering about how does the skewing of the results, for example, which team won, affect difficulty? As in, if you had motions which are, if some motion heavily favors proposition, then it is more difficult for one side, but not as difficult for the other side.
Yeah.
Does that factor into your thinking about difficulty?
Yes. I really should have probably named this background context rather than difficulty, again, for reasons discussed. This is a very good point, and this is what actually we'll discuss next. It's a good intro for imbalance, or generally like how teams perform well. I think this is slightly separate for what I'm trying to get at the core of difficulty, because I'm trying to assess how much knowledge you need to yap about a certain topic when you step on the debate scene, right? But it is true that for some teams, or for some positions, it's going to be more difficult to debate in a certain position. I would rather call this balance or imbalance and so forth. This is a very good note. We can, however, also make metrics based on imbalance. So you could probably reason, in some extent, that maybe motions that are imbalanced somehow are more difficult usually, because they, I don't know, you connect these two somehow and justify that with a structural reason or so forth. And you can maybe even make an argument for the other side. I don't think we'll know for sure without like an objective metric. So I think at some point I'll do the speaker's course thing, and then we can all meet to discuss this again. Let's talk about then imbalance, unless there's further comments on previous topics. I believe not. So quick summary of what we discussed. We took a bunch of motions, roughly 1,000. We took out the motion types, the would, predicts, prefers, yada yada. We then looked a little bit at their categories or themes, so politics, econ, and so forth, and then roughly touched upon difficulty, so how much background knowledge is required to debate a certain motion. This is the last part of the presentation then, and we'll talk about a little bit about imbalance, and this is maybe also a little bit more technical, but maybe more interesting if you are setting motions, or just generally if you're debating motions. If you've ever debated and you're like, oh my god, this closing opposition position, like there's nothing I can say anymore. Well, there's going to be some justifications for you, so you don't have to, you don't have to, next time you are called out for copium, you have a good answer. Philosophy then for how we measure imbalance. And this is something that is not yet super incorporated into Tabicat for 4 teams, but it is incorporated for 2 teams. I have not come up with this metric. Smarter people have in 2012, somewhere written on a blog post. So I highly encourage you to check out. The slides are going to be available as well, so you can go there and so forth. But the rough justification for this and intuition that we should follow is that every side in a British parliamentary debate, so we have opening government, opening opposition, closing opposition, should expect to earn 1.5 points from a round. Justification for this being that you earn 3 points for first place, 2 points for second place, 1 point for third place, 0 points for fourth place. If you take the expected value or the average of that, you have 6 total points that are distributed across the debate. And then on average, you would expect to have earned 1.5, so 6 divided by 4. And then what we can do is measure how much differently are the points divided. So if, on average, we take a tournament or a round, and we have 20 teams debate that specific motion, and on average, 2 points go to opening government, and then comparatively only 1 point goes to opening opposition, right? So we have this split between 3 points. Yeah, then it's probably a motion that favors opening government. And there is some statistical analysis on when we can say that this is significant, when this is random, and so forth. I encourage you to read the blog. But that's the rough justification that we need to keep track of. I have a Mentimeter here for some rough opinions, and this is just generally a vibe check on motions in debate. So from 1 to 5, you can rate how much you agree with the statements that motions at large tournaments are generally balanced or are balanced, and then motions in debate clubs or sessions, or you can even put smaller tournaments into there, are balanced as well. So vibe check, and we'll see. All right, so I think intuitively it makes sense that people trust larger tournaments more, perhaps because there is a chief adjudication panel that meets together 1 or 2 months before the tournament and agrees on certain motions, and then they try to vet them as much as possible, maybe even run some test rounds. And then people generally think that, of course, in clubs or sessions where there isn't as much care put, there's going to be a bit less balance. Still, however, we are trending towards more than not balanced if we take the average of 2.5. So generally, people think that motions are pretty balanced. So not much copium in this room. Very nice. Let's go back to the slides then, and I'll show the data, and then I can justify it as well. But roughly what we can do is for each round that we have, so for each motion, we can compute this statistic machine, and then we can classify how likely is this motion to be balanced or imbalanced. You can never say with 100% certainty, because there might be just chance that on a given day, right, you had 20 teams debate the same motion and all 20 opening governments won, but there's nothing to do with the motion. It's just benevolent luck from God or whatever, right? Of course, this usually doesn't happen. The chance of that happening is very small. So what we can do is then we can say how likely or how much evidence is there that this motion is balanced or not. And here is the rough distribution of how this then pans out for motions. And you'll see that from left, we have no evidence. So this means that this motion is balanced, or we can expect it to be balanced generally. And then on the right, we have strong evidence for the fact that this motion is imbalanced. So this was actually quite counterintuitive to what I was thinking. This is a very weird distribution. It makes very little-ish sense as well. So some things that we can infer from here is that motions generally seem to be either very balanced, right, or generally balanced. We can say confidently that they're balanced, or very imbalanced. So we can quite confidently say that they're very imbalanced. And there's little-ish motions that are somewhere in the middle ground. This might be due to some statistic reason. Might also be that I messed up something in the code. That's always possible. But I've cross-checked this intuitively, and we will do so ourselves as well. But any comments or questions on this so far? Yes?
Is the evidence linked to the deviation from the 1.5 points
Yeah.
per side?
So roughly how it works is that the stronger the evidence is for a motion being imbalanced, the more deviation there is from the expected 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5.
So no evidence is a perfect 1.5, or what's the 1.5, or no evidence?
Roughly, yes. It might be like a 1. It's on a large scale. So some things to point out from a statistics perspective is this is discarding motions that have less than 10 debates or 10 pairings. So less than 10 rooms have debated this, because we can't really. The predictions don't make sense if you just have one team and then it just happens that opening government won and so forth. So this is roughly for, again, caveats, for motions that have been debated more than in 10 rooms in parallel. Yes, and then for no evidence, or there is very small deviation, or it is statistically reasonable deviation. So it might be like 1.4, 1.6, that's roughly happened, 1.45, something along those lines. We can look at some of the more concrete numbers in a second as well. Other thoughts, questions, comments? If not, we can proceed. And before I reveal some of the statistics and we look at, for instance, how this, so that you get an idea of the numbers, you can also do a little bit of an intuition test. Here are two motions. One of them is super balanced, as in practically no evidence. One of them is almost extremely imbalanced towards one side. Which one do you think is which? So I'll read them out as well. The first one is, this house supports dating apps that are exclusively, tailored to members of particular ethnic communities, e.g. AsianDating.com, where white people meet, etc. Versus, the second motion is, this house believes that it is in the interests of religious leaders to forbid the use of artificial intelligence for any religious purposes. I'll give you 3-ish minutes. If you want to discuss with a pair, that's fine as well. And then we'll have a show of hands. Let's have a show of hands for who thinks that the first motion is the one that is unbalanced.
What?
First motion, the one that is unbalanced, the one that is referencing dating apps for ethnic minorities. Who thinks it is unbalanced? Okay, so I think we have 3 out of 15, 20 people.
Sorry, for which?
First one.
It's unbalanced.
Yes, not balanced, not a good motion. Okay, who thinks it is the second motion that is not balanced? Okay, so a vast majority of people. This is very interesting, because a vast majority of you are wrong. The first motion is very unbalanced against closing opposition specifically. The second one is surprisingly balanced in the sense that there were 20 rooms, I think, roughly that debated it, and all expected average. I think this shows how tough it is for adjudicators to set motions, how tough it is for you to initially see. In hindsight, I think this makes a little bit of sense, right? Think about dating apps that are exclusively tailored to members of ethnic communities. I think intuitively, it makes sense that this is a good thing to have because you are promoting diversity and representation of ethnic minorities. So it's an easy case for opening government to make, right? For opening opposition, you can probably find some things that are bad about this. For opening opposition, maybe someone smarter can also fill in, but perhaps ideas of, some kind of bubble emerging, or just generally people abusing these communities or not encouraging any diversity or anything of the sort. Maybe someone else can fill in a better point for OO. But then for closing opposition, I think it's particularly tough because you have to go against this diversity point and you have to not be derivative of opening opposition. So you can't say the same things that they mentioned. So I think to me that's rational, kind of holds up, but I would not be able to say ahead of time that one is specifically more balanced or unbalanced. So again, very tough to justify.
Do
So
you also remember if it was all heavy? Because it seems like...
For the first motion, yeah. So we can look at some of the data in more detail. I don't have a better presentation for it than the raw notebook. I'm sorry about that. I think this is the raw notebook. God, I really need glasses. Let me do one thing. I think this was, can I zoom into here somewhere? If I zoom a little bit. Oh, that's zooming out. Yeah. And let's close that. And then, okay, so let's look at this one first, religious leaders to use artificial intelligence. So this is the, again, sorry for the poor statistics here, but this is the opening government, opening opposition, closing government, closing opposition. You'll notice this is not around 1.5. The reason for this is that this is the sum of all the points that they gained. So if you earned 1 point and then another room or 2 points and then you sum up these, but we can roughly do a small calculation. If we go here, we see n equals 20. That means there's 20 rounds. So we divide this, 34 divided by 20, roughly 1.5-ish. I checked that 28 divided by 20 is 1.4 or anything of the sort, something like that as well. So this is roughly in that area of 1.4, 1.5, 1.6 points per team. If we go to the top then, we should be able to see, or is it the bottom? Wait, where am I? I think here, yes, is the motion about dating apps. And we can see from here how many rounds were there. 27, so tougher division math, but it's okay. We'll see that this is roughly going to be 2 points for government. Am I calculating correctly? I think so. And then we'll see that for opening opposition, it's a little bit less. For closing government, it's even less. And for closing opposition, surprisingly little. Like this is a very, very bad expected value. It's less than 1. So if we divide 16 by 27. So yeah, a very tough closing opposition point. Yes, Martin?
I think this statistical analysis and this approach is very interesting, but I also think it would be very interesting and we would maybe get a different result if we use a different metric for imbalance. For example, the presence of statistical data or information. For example, in my opinion, the first motion that is unbalanced is also quite easy to defend because there's a lot of data about couples that were split or divorced because of cultural differences. So that's an argument, for example, that can easily be used for in favor of dating apps that are for specific ethnic groups.
Yeah.
Whereas for the second motion that is technically balanced, I think it will be definitely harder for one side to defend because obviously artificial intelligence is not mentioned in religious books. So I don't think there is enough data or statistical evidence to back it up. So if we use the metric of existing research, then I think we will have definitely balanced levels.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And there is also some other ideas of how we measure imbalance and so forth that are interesting. For instance, some people argue that every team should have an equal chance of placing first, second, or third, which is a slightly different statistical metric. This was actually the argument by the same guy who made this statistic, and then he superseded that with the second version. Yes, let's discuss further. I'm not sure who was first between you two. Yeah, go ahead.
This is like rebutting this, I guess. So this is DP data, so like you cannot use any like outside knowledge. Like you cannot say that there is a statistic that says that this is true. First of all, because it's unverifiable in terms of a DP debate if the statistic is actually true. So it serves no purpose during a debate. Therefore, for the purposes of balance, it's also not
Yeah, but I think the point being that there is more research existing in the world and more discussion about this topic, which might make it easier for someone to debate this. I think this is a fair point to make. However, on average, right, people will not know all the research. So in one room, it might lean actually OO, or it might even lean CO. Like there were still some CO wins, right? We're not discarding them completely. And this might be the case that they were just better debaters or they knew more about this topic and so forth. However, when you take an average of 27 rounds, right, or 27 rooms, right, we can't definitively say that this motion is unbalanced because, again, remember, it's probability, but we can say with a pretty high confidence that it is not a very balanced motion. Yes, Dominic?
I like the visualization, but I think that the most important is, as you mentioned, I can agree with the possibility of getting all the places during the debate. Because even though I could get a high average, be, for example, every time second in each motion, but because it is imbalanced, I cannot possibly win it anytime. Because I can imagine motions where closing opposition cannot ever win. Like, even though they would be second every time, they would have high average, it wouldn't be imbalanced in this sort of view. They couldn't win because of the text of the motion.
Yeah, so this is one caveat and a good counter example, or just generally like hypothetical example. To restate what Dominic said, there is a possibility where you always play second or third, which means you earn on average 1.5-ish points. However, you're never able to access the first place for whatever reason. So it's fundamentally unbalanced. This analysis would not flag that. And there is an argument to be made for probabilities of placing first or probabilities of placing evenly across all spots. So everybody should have a 25% chance of placing first and so forth. There are some problems with that though as well, right? It's generally first a little bit harder to measure, but also secondly, it's a little bit harder to set motions like this. There's going to be less motions that fall into that category, but there's an interesting blog post on the same page about this as well, so we can discuss that.
For me, it was like in the beginning when we started discussing these like motions and what are balanced. I actually think that like the second motion is more balanced because it like there's like one debate like inside there's like one debate of like what will artificial intelligence do or how it will look like because it's now like not established. And secondly, there's like whole another debate going on of what is interest of religious leaders and who religious people are leaders. Like are they like do they just more like want more followers and like that bring their money directly because they come to them, or like that more people have access to some like psychological support and such. So I was thinking that because messy debate, it's actually more balanced because it's equally difficult for like
Yeah.
all sides to actually establish what are the interests of the religious leaders and in what in what proportion which like religious leaders fall in which category and how then it could like be forbidden or not and in what cases and such. So I think that like the balancing thing, it's kind of like not a, maybe like a rebuttal director, but like clarification kind of that I guess that the balance sometimes works not only in a way who has enough research, but like if no one has research and it's like a messy debate, it's like still balance.
Yeah, that is a good point. And I've tried to look at some of that going forward. For instance, okay, well, how about we take this imbalance metric that we have and split it by theme. So here I'm taking the median, I believe. Did I clarify that better? I did, thankfully. The numbers are somewhat arbitrary. This is related to the statistic, but you can see on the right, if you squint really hard, there is no evidence, extremely low evidence, and progressing to higher evidence, right? So we can roughly take median, meaning that we have a huge population of debates that are about politics, and we take the average or center debate in that place. So we discard the outliers, basically. And then we see, okay, a given debate, if we just pick a standard debate from that distribution, is it going to be balanced or not? And we generally see that in motions related to religious ideology, for instance, for some reason, they are somehow more balanced. Perhaps this is the reasoning given that if everybody doesn't know about religion anything, then it makes for a balanced debate. Maybe they're just inherently more balanced, I'm not sure. And then as we progress towards more techie, I guess, or somehow like more international relations, maybe geopolitics, debates, they seem to get slightly more imbalanced. So I'm not sure what to make of this. That's why I'm asking questions as well. Let's go there first, I think, and then, yeah.
So another question, because I think there's a big difference in the way emotion is imbalanced, because it can be imbalanced in depth, which is top half has higher average than bottom half.
Yeah.
It can be, which is just not the problem with the motion itself, but with the depth of the motion. So for example, it would be good for WSDC, but it's not good enough for BP. There is like bench, so golf and op, which is just like probably an inherent problem with the motion, that like one side is just wins more and is it golf sweep or an op sweep. And there's a third option of like it's like kind of a specific way where just like one CO gets fucked over, right?
Yeah.
Or like one OO for some reason because CO can outrank or whatever. So does that account for that, or does that group everything together?
Yeah, so this groups everything together, but this is one of the other points of further research that I would like to do about this. Previous being about looking at the difficulties in terms of speaker scores. The other being understanding the imbalances, as you mentioned, on different levels, right? This kind of just is imbalanced generally in emotion, favors one side or favors one bench across the way. It just doesn't make sense statistically. But there is some interesting probably findings you can make if you look at which favors government, which favors opposition, which on average favors more opposition or government in generally. And this is also not included in this specific workshop, but part of the purpose of this is also to look at other areas. And there is actually a meaningful bias inherently, probably, in BP debates in the sense that typically teams on one side of the bench win more in any given motion than on the other side of the bench. But yeah, I'll leave that for later at some point. Was there some hand from here? Others? Yes?
I had the same question.
Okay.
And also, it would be interesting to think whether info slides affect and how you can make a figure on, especially from a CAP or coach point of view. Like if it's a prop-op, like imbalance, then maybe adding something to the info slide or removing something can just kill the balance.
Yes, this is also an interesting point to make. All right, then if no other notes, we can proceed to a slide that asks you for comments, very fittingly. The comments were already made. But of course, this would not be complete without addressing some of the limitations of the study. Some of those being relatively small sample size. We're dealing with about 1,000 plus motions out of 10,000 plus, probably 20, maybe even 100,000 plus. I'm not sure. I think debate data has around 11,000. There's probably more that exist in the world as well. We are dealing with only British parliamentary for now. So sorry, you got slightly clickbaited. And then I might have messed up the code. That's always a possibility. Last person I would trust is myself. So the nice part about this is that we have a lot of possibilities for exciting future research that we can do. Some of those were already mentioned here, and that I'll write down and flag the 3 ideas that were floating around. But some of that I've thought as well is like, okay, well, can we hypothetically know if a motion is balanced or imbalanced before running it in a tournament? So right now our analysis relies on taking all the wins that have happened and all the rounds, the results that have happened. Could we train some kind of classifier or some kind of machine learning model that just takes in a motion and then is like, okay, this is going to be balanced, or this is going to be imbalanced, or maybe even better, this is going to be imbalanced towards one side or not? I think that would be an interesting thing to do. Another question you might have is also, is this something that we should do? Nobody really asks those in programming that often. Secondly is, can we generate original high-quality motions with AI? Of course, you can go to ChatGPT right now and generate a motion, but can we take this a little bit further? Can we somehow ensure quality based on the motion back? So maybe we can fine-tune or refine an existing model to do better, given the database of motions that we have. Maybe we can even train a custom model completely to actually generate motions. A lot of ideas. Some others, I'll open space as well. There's some really good ones that were mentioned, but if you have anything else, you can say now. You can also approach me later. There'll be context and details and so forth. Yes, in 5 minutes, roughly, less. Last part then for this presentation. This is more or less the conclusion, but you will in fact find the most of the things that we've discussed at data.debates.fi. You can scan the QR code. You can go there yourself by just typing in the link. It's not completely finished, and it is under construction still, but many of the things that we discussed. So I can show you roughly what the page looks like. This will have statistics for motions, including the motion types we discussed, the motion themes, a motion cloud where you can sort of play around with all the motions, maybe see them in a better way, which are which. You can also search from our database of motions, so you can filter by a certain category or theme. You can ask for a specific tournament, a specific year, a motion type that you want. There'll be more that are coming here with the data that we speak. Again, very much under construction. But we really appreciate you checking out, and hopefully some of the ideas that we discussed here will also be implemented there. Oh my God, what is this? It's a button managed by Finnish National Debating Society. Oh, you can check us out over here. It's a new website that we recently started. There's myself, there's Omar, there's Lissy, also one of our teachers. If you want to become a member and just a mail sign up for events or anything of the sort, we'd love to sponsor your trip to Finland at some point or encourage generally international cooperation and so forth. So please check us out. Pardon? Yeah. I think that concludes all of this. So thank you very much. If you want to reach out to me.